1 year ago this week, our nation lost a giant, a man with a righteous purpose and a remarkable legacy, John Robert Lewis, who dedicated his life to the cause of justice. From Troy, Alabama, to a bridge in Selma, to the halls of this very Congress, he put his body on the line for every American's sacred right to vote. John Lewis never stopped fighting because he understood that democracy is a commitment we have to make again and again and again. As he wrote in the last days of his life, the vote is the most powerful, nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. John Lewis understood the power and the fragility of our multiracial democracy because he did so much to build it in his lifetime. At the age of 25, he led peaceful protesters on a march through Alabama to demand their right to vote. And as the world witnessed, they were attacked, gassed, and beaten by police officers. They were attacked because the right to vote is power, and white supremacists feared the power of people of color exercising that right. But out of the pain and outrage over this bloody Sunday came one of our country's greatest monuments to freedom, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For nearly 50 years, the Voting Rights Act stood as a guardian of our multiracial democracy. It outlawed literacy tests. It prohibited voting procedures that would deny or abridge the right to vote on account of race or color. It gave the United States Department of Justice the power to review any new voting rules in places with a history of voter suppression and to block rules with discriminatory effects. And critically, the Voting Rights Act recognized the important role of the federal government in protecting the right to vote. It helped guarantee communities of color their rightful voice in our democracy. Over time, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized 4 times, including most recently in 2006, when Representative Lewis and a nearly unanimous Congress voted to affirm the continued need for its protections. That's right, passage of the Voting Rights Act and every reauthorization of the act was always on a bipartisan basis. But in 2013, 5 conservative justices of the Supreme Court overrode the bipartisan consensus of Congress. In spite of the voluminous record assembled by the Congress and the reality of the country around them, these 5 justices effectively ended preclearance and gutted a key protection of the Voting Rights Act. As Justice Ginsburg, the late Justice Ginsburg, wrote in her dissent, it was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Well, the storm of voter suppression is most certainly pouring over us now. Mr. President, in 2020, in the midst of an ongoing global health pandemic, our nation held one of the most successful and secure elections in our history. Voters of color made their voices heard in record numbers and confirmed again that our democracy is strongest when all eligible Americans are able to participate. But instead of celebrating this remarkable achievement, Republican legislative leaders in state houses around the country this year have proposed and passed bill after bill after bill restricting the right to vote and restricting access to the ballot. They're doing this on the basis of lies about voter fraud and rooted firmly in the legacy of white supremacy. They continue to do so as we speak. The Supreme Court's most recent anti-democracy decision in the Brnovich case, which eviscerated a key remaining protection of the Voting Rights Act, will only embolden these attacks. But so far in this Senate, our Republican colleagues have turned a blind eye, choosing to be complicit in the outright assault on our democracy. Senate Republicans have refused to even open a debate on voting rights legislation. Instead, they prefer to abuse the filibuster to enable Republican legislative leaders across the country to continue their assaults. Mr. President, our democracy is on the line. The unfinished work of John Lewis remains. We must summon the courage to act. That's why I'm committed to passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which will protect the right to vote for all people. I can think of no more fitting way to honor the memory of a man who chose our democracy as the struggle of his lifetime. Mr. President, when I was first elected California Secretary of State to serve as the Chief Elections Officer for the state of California, I sought out the counsel of John Lewis. For more than 45 minutes during our first meeting, and time and again after that, John guided me with his wisdom, taught me by his example, and inspired me through his courage. He was always gracious with his time, warm with his spirit, and true in his conviction. And he reminded me, as he reminded so many of us, that our struggle is a struggle of a lifetime. As he said, we cannot be afraid to make some noise and get into good trouble, necessary trouble, along the way. In fact, given the circumstances, it's exactly what we need to do today. As a bipartisan Senate, if we can, or as the elected Democratic majority, if we must, it is imperative that we pass legislation to preserve our democracy. We must carry the torch that John Lewis carried for us for so long and build for all Americans a democracy that is as free, as fair, as accessible, and as inclusive as we can possibly make it. And we must remain hopeful in this pursuit. You see, despite the scars that he bore and the hatred that he faced down, John Lewis was fundamentally a hopeful man, a man who never abandoned the youthful spirit that carried him across that bridge in Selma. And he always looked to the next generation for leadership, for energy and inspiration to carry the cause forward. It is now on us to take up his work. There is no better way for us to honor the legacy of John Lewis. Thank you, Mr. President.